The holidays crept up on me faster than ever this year. Before I knew it, there was a week until Christmas, and there were still a few gifts left to purchase. My wife gently reminded me that I had promised to make her mother a handmade gift this holiday season. Now here I was, with no present and just days to go before our family celebration. As I pondered how I could possibly create something perfect in such a short time span, my eyes landed on a reclaimed pine board I had picked up last summer. Its natural brown color and slightly weathered texture seemed like it would work well for this last-minute project. An idea began swirling. Maybe I could transform this humble plank into a custom spice rack with brass accents for my mother-in-law's kitchen. With the clock ticking, I hastily drew up some plans, gathered supplies, and set to work. In this video, I'll take you along as I build this last-minute Christmas gift. The result isn't fancy, but I hope the homemade touches will remind my mother-in-law of the care that went into this in-a-pinch present every time she reaches for a spice in her kitchen. With my gift idea in mind, I headed to the shop to start prepping the reclaimed pine board. This old wood was quite distorted and twisted, so the first step was getting one flat surface to serve as my reference face. I got out my homemade flattening jig, just a scrap piece of kitchen cabinet that I know is nice and flat. I fastened the twisted pine to the jig to hold everything steady. Riding on the flat jig, I sent the pine board through my planer. This initial pass smoothed out the high points and created a flat side. Now that I had one flat reference face, I could remove it from the jig, flip it over, and flatten the second face to be exactly parallel. Next, I squared the edges by running them through the table saw. Once my first board was flat and square, I repeated the whole process with the second part of the pine board. My lumber was now milled flat, so it was time to start cutting everything to size. I had ordered some beautiful glass spice jars from Amazon that should perfectly complement the wood and brass. Those jars measured about 5.6 centimeters across, so I planned shelves with a depth of 7.5 centimeters. That extra depth should be perfect to hold the jars in place once I add the brass bars across the front. I cut all the parts to rough thickness on the table saw, then dialed in the exact smooth and even thickness by sending them through the thickness planer a few times. Finally, I used the miter saw and chopped the boards to length. Now I had all the sized parts prepped and ready for assembly. Before assembly, it was time for the not-so-exciting but essential task of sanding. I went over all the milled lumber with 120 grit to remove any lingering machine marks. After the coarse pass, I stepped up to 240 grit to smooth everything out until no scratches remained, and I had a silky smooth finish. I am always tempted to rush the sanding stages, but taking my time really pays off, leaving me with wood that feels good to handle and touch. I finally had a stack of boards that were starting to look more like project parts instead of plain old planks. The next step was to add some decorative functionality by installing brass bars across the shelf fronts. These bars will keep the glass spice jars from sliding out, while the glittering metal will add a touch of elegance. I marked and drilled holes about 1 centimeter back from the edge on each shelf. I used my sorter shop drill stand to ensure I kept the holes the correct depth and square. After drilling corresponding holes in the vertical parts, I test-fitted my brass bars to make sure everything aligned properly before final glue-up. With all my holes drilled and brass bars test-fitted, it was finally time for assembly. I started by drilling some pocket holes out of sight in the back boards. These angled holes allowed me to screw everything together tightly to build a strong skeleton frame for the shelves. After screwing these parts together and adding the brass bar in place, it was time to test fit each shelf. Once everything was aligned, I applied some wood glue before temporarily tacking them with pin nails. My plan was to drill holes once the glue dried and add dowels to fix the shelves for permanent strength. For now, I relied on the glue and nails to hold the shelves in position while I started to fix the top part in place. As I started to attach the top piece, things started to unravel. I applied wood glue along the top shelves, then went to tack the top board in place with my cordless Parkside nail gun. But suddenly the gun just stopped working entirely. It had always been a little touchy in the months since I bought it, succeeding or failing randomly. Yet now it failed me completely at the worst moment. Though I'm normally a huge fan of Parkside's budget tool quality, my almost new nailer leaving me stranded was a big disappointment. With no way to temporarily tack the top on, I tried immediately drilling the holes for the permanent dowel supports. The first hole went cleanly through both layers of wood, but drilling the second dowel hole near the edge caused the soft pine to crumble away in chunks, leaving the top piece unusable. Nothing left to do but pry the top loose, scrap the damaged wood, and cut an entirely new part. I had hoped assembly would go smoothly, but thinking up solutions to problems on the spot seems to be a big part of learning woodworking. That mishap with the edge of the wood crumbling made me rethink my plan of using dowel joinery. Time was running out and I didn't want to risk more damaged pieces and potential delays. Instead, my new plan was to firmly secure all the parts by countersinking screws to fix them into place. I could then plug the holes with wood filler, which should practically disappear into the finish. It turned out this was an even quicker way to finalize the assembly without compromising aesthetics or strength. I just drilled pilot holes for each screw to prevent splitting the soft reclaimed wood. The screws pulled the shelves tight and kept everything square. Now that the shelves were securely screwed into their final positions, there were just some leftover holes that needed patching up. I applied a pine-colored wood filler into each of the screw holes, along with the tiny holes left from temporarily pinning parts earlier. Once the filler dried after a few hours, I used 240 grit sandpaper to smooth everything flush. With the filler dried and sanded smooth, the holes were no longer visible. The spice rack was ready for me to apply stain and finish it up. Just before I began to apply stain, I noticed that the outer edges looked a little harsh and square. I wanted to soften them up a little before applying finish. I used a 3mm roundover bit to gently ease the edges. Running the bit along the sides and top surface gave the spice rack a subtle profile that broke up those sharp 90-degree angles. Now light could gracefully catch these rounded edges. It's a tiny detail, but one that adds a touch of elegance to this otherwise basic spice rack. Again, as I approached applying the final finish, it suddenly dawned on me. My mother-in-law wanted to hang this spice rack, not set it on the counter. How could I forget to account for wall mounting? Thankfully, it was a quick adaptation at this stage. I used a T-slot cutter bit to slice horizontal hanging slots into the back board. Cutting these wall mount channels took barely a minute, and now the rack could neatly slip onto screws mounted on the kitchen wall. Finally, everything was structurally complete, and I could apply the aesthetic finish. My original vision was for a golden teak stain to complement the warm brass bars. But unfortunately, when I tested the teak hue on my pine boards, it looked a dirty shade of yellow. Not a nice colour for this project, and just not natural. My only other stain option on hand was a darker rosewood tone. I applied an even coating across all the surfaces, let it penetrate fully, then wiped off the excess. The colour was deeper than I envisioned originally, but it created a sophisticated contrast against the bright brass, and the single application provided full, even coverage without needing a second pass. In the end, the deeper rosewood isn't what I planned, but it adds a refined, intentional look. I'm filled with satisfaction seeing this spice rack develop from an idea to reality. While there were certainly challenges necessitating small adaptations along the way, overcoming those hurdles has made the end result feel so much sweeter. I gained valuable experience improvising solutions when pieces broke or tools failed me. Every build is a learning process, and I emerge eager to apply these lessons to my next woodworking projects. Now installed in my mother-in-law's kitchen, I find joy in imagining her utilizing this custom spice rack for years to come as she flavors her family's meals. Though my original vision transformed from teak tones to deeper rosewood, The stain nicely brings out the wood grain while contrasting the glistening brass bars. I appreciate that what began as a last-minute holiday gift holds a timeless handmade look she'll treasure. As I consider what my next project might be, I'm feeling motivated to try making a piece of furniture that I can sell locally. I want to carefully plan the design, taking potential customer appeal into account. I'll research what furniture tends to sell well, while still incorporating little special touches. The practice I have gained through building this spice rack will serve me well as I work towards creating my first marketable woodworking project soon.